Hello and welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am not your host, Ben Wheeler, and I am certainly not here. Instead, I'm going to let Anthony Marquetta and Carolyn Furlong speak for themselves. Have a good one.
Hello, I will be your host today, Anthony Marquetta. Today we are Benless. It was pre-scheduled. You'll have to ask him about why, but I assume it has something to do with the feds who have been following him. Cannot confirm.
They're gonna
Anyway,
take me alive. I'm not gonna lie to you
ah,
guys. You should cut all ties with me. I'm not gonna do. I can't stand under torture, man. Can't do it.
ha, nothing to worry about. It's too late for the rest of us now. Anyway, today we will be talking about with my, because again, Ben is not here, obviously. You didn't hear him. He's not present. You just imagine the voice. Uh, I am here with my guest, Caroline Furlong, who is an authoress who has been published in Search of Us, Story Hack, and various other small publications. I know is working on several novels and has been a guest on the show multiple times. Most recently, 2 weeks ago? So, has not been long. Uh,
Yeah, it was 2 weeks ago with 86.
yes. So, welcome back. I hope you're familiar with everything still.
That's correct.
And as Ben has put in our title, we're talking about the fall of heroism in Marvel. So the real truth is that what we were actually going to talk about was, man, modern Marvel is really bad. But the fall of heroism is a pretty good shorthand for, I think, for what has happened. Would you agree with that?
Yes, actually, because that's pretty much what has happened. The comics were campy to start with, but they were always presenting a picture of heroism, what a human being dedicated to virtue could accomplish. Some of the stories may not have done it as well as others, but that was the general intention. That's the focus of the archetypes of the specific heroes in Marvel Comics. And that focus has been lamentably lost for, well, in the movies, most of Phase 3, and before that, at least in the 1990 comics.
Yeah, the comic scene of the 1990s is interesting. Brian Niemeyer often talks about the 1997 cultural collapse. And I'm not sure how much of that if you could genuinely date that to like exactly 1997, and how much of that is just searching for things that confirm that outcome, but I don't think it's entirely meritless. So at the very least, something was happening in the 90s, There was a loss of culture among various disciplines, and comics were definitely one of them. So there is a brilliant comic, I don't know if you've read or not. It's by, of all people, like the writer of it at least, is Mark Waid. Now, for those who don't know who Mark Waid is, he is a notorious SJW. Uh, Probably one of the major reasons that modern Marvel is so bad. But he he is, in my opinion at least, a sad story or a tragic story more than anything else, because he made a comic with an artist, a brilliant artist who you might have heard of, because this comic actually is one of the things that catapulted him to fame, though I think he already had a reputation before that. Alex Ross. Are you familiar with Ross?
No, I'm not, but it's hard for me to keep track in the mainstream of the
Yeah,
writers
I
and artists.
actually I unironically recommend that you look up Alex Ross. He's a genius in his own right. So Mark Waid and Alex Ross collaborated on this beautiful, like, hand painted comic called Kingdom Come. Uh,
Mhm.
and Kingdom Come was sort of billed as a response to those 1990s anti-hero comic books that exploded onto the market. I don't want to say it became so popular, because that's actually the thing. They did not become popular. They collapsed the industry, but they flooded the market. And Kingdom Come is sort of a response to that. So the story of Kingdom Come, and I'm going to spoil it, but excuse me, but I don't think it actually really matters because if you read it yourself, it's worth reading in its own right. Even if you know the ending, but I think it's worth talking about
Mhm.
in the context of what we're discussing. So the story of Kingdom Come is that we're at some point in the future, and I don't remember if they give an exact year, and whether they give an exact year does not really matter. It's the future,
Mhm.
and Superman is still alive, not really looking that much older.
Mhm.
He see and living on a farm in Kansas. Lois Lane is dead. We don't know how long, but not of any particularly interesting reason. She died of old age.
Mhm.
Uh, Batman is still alive. Gotham City is now basically being run by Batman and his army of like mechanized, police patrolling the city. So he's turned Gotham City into something of a police state. But interestingly, he is not portrayed in an entirely negative light throughout the story. He ends the story a good guy, and it's implied somewhat that Gotham City is one of the only places left that's like really kept a lid on law and order. And Wonder Woman is also still alive. And the story is that this new breed of anti-heroes has arisen that thinks that the way that the regular heroes are doing it is just not going to cut it anymore, and
Mhm.
that they need to be taken out and they need to be replaced with their new brand of heroes. And Superman tries to stop them. Now, it's been a little bit since I've read the story in full, so I'm going to be skipping past large chunks of it, which is well and good anyway, since, we have a big discussion ahead of us.
Mhm.
But basically, it all ends with they've gotten a nuke set up, and the nuke is going. They've somehow tricked all of the old school heroes together, and the nuke is going to blow them all up and kill everyone, leaving the anti heroes.
Oh dear.
So, Superman, for whatever reason, I forget exactly why, he's not in a position to stop it. But Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel, or I should say Shazam, to those who don't know, is. And Superman says to him, Billy, it needs to be you, because Captain Marvel's Billy Batson. He says it
Yeah.
needs to be you because I'm not human. I'm an alien. I am not a human being, but you are both. You have the power of a god and you're a human being. You're the one who needs to make the choice. Do we really deserve to all be killed? And there's like this whole thing where like Captain Marvel's mind has been broken down over the years, and the
Ugh.
nuke goes off. So Superman believes that, Billy either didn't make the choice fast enough or couldn't do it, or maybe he decided to let them all die. And Superman loses it. And he decides that, like, the people have betrayed them, so he's going to kill everyone. By the way, I really like this. It's much better than Injustice, because, like, if you've ever played Injustice or seen the stories of that, it's like Lois died, and that turns Superman evil. No, Superman
Mm.
turns at somewhat, sort of, kind of evil, because a nuclear bomb destroyed all of his friends. And everybody else, it seems to be the fault of everybody else who could have stopped it and didn't. That's a much more plausible
Mhm.
explanation to me. He goes to like a shopping mall and he's about to take everyone down when Wonder Woman shows up and reveals that Billy actually managed to absorb, he died, but he managed to absorb a lot of the blast. And while a lot of the heroes died, a lot of them survived as well. And that calms Superman down. And Uh, it's seen as like a love letter to the older DC comics. It's also looked at sometimes as like a goodbye to the dark age of comics.
Yeah.
It's an excellent, excellent comic book. I believe the villain ends up turning himself in at the end of all things. Superman ends up with Wonder Woman, and we learn that Batman likes his coffee black because, of course, he does. Uh,
Yeah. Of course he does.
yeah, it would be disappointing if he didn't. Uh, it's a very, very good. It's a very, very good comic, and I highly recommend it. But it was making a few interesting points. I
Yeah.
think that the main point it was making was that those '90s heroes, like they did not have the staying power. They could never work. You could try and get rid of the classic heroes, and you could argue even that they needed a pruning. That, maybe it got too campy, maybe not all of them worked. But ultimately, it's their ideals that are going to be the ones that on, and it's their ideals that are going to be the ones that really, that are going to be what people keep coming back for, right?
Yeah, that
So,
sounds like a that sounds like a good story. I'll see if I can Kingdom Come, right?
Kingdom Come, the artwork in it is unbelievable. So I have seen people say, now Mark Waid, like I said, is notorious SJW, one of the worst.
Mhm.
Uh, and he was the writer for Kingdom Come. However, I've heard people say that it's probably Alex Ross who deserves more of the credit for this particular story, which is something that I can believe. Now, I bring this up because even though the MCU is the one that's in the news cycle lately, right? But
Yeah.
what happens in Marvel Comics is at least notable because it's all happening in the MCU as well, just faster on a shorter timeline. What happened in Marvel Comics happened over decades, and what's happening in the MCU is happening over, 20 years, as opposed to like 60, 80, 100, whatever.
Yeah.
When was Timely Comics founded?
Timely Comics was founded in the 1930s or 40s, I believe. You'll have to look it up to be sure. But going back to the dark age of comics, it was actually in 1993 that the comic book industry started to decline. Annual combined sales from all publishers, which had been close to $1 billion in 1993, declined to 2,270 million. Uh, so actually, probably 1993 is not the exact date, but it would have been around 1993 to 1995. Uh, the Batman and Robin film had flopped. Marvel Comics went through Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Many notable artists left the company, and their rival DC topped them in sales. This was when Brian Michael Bendis was hired to start an imprint called Ultimate Marvel that would bring new readers
Uh,
into the
yeah,
franchise.
Bendis is one of the villains of the story.
Oh yes, uh, and it only gets worse because he actually managed to boost sales, but he did so by transliterating for a new generation the story of Peter Parker into the Ultimate Comics. And this it worked. It it streamlined Peter Parker's story, made it easier for new comic book readers to find it and get into it because and this was Bill Jemis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right, was a lawyer who uh worked mainly in collectible trading card companies. And I'm not sure how Marvel got him, but what he pointed out was that they were publishing stories that were all but impossible for teens to read. And because they had about 40 they started it the Avengers started in 1963, but it was probably a year before that that Stan started with most of his other creations, like Iron Man, Fantastic Four, the Hulk. They'd been in circulation at least sometime before the Avengers started, and the Avengers were a direct answer to the Justice League comics at the request of Timely Comics' president to Stan Lee, who was not president at the time. He became president later. So that is a valid point in that in the 90s, unless you were willing to ask someone, the they didn't have Wikipedia or anything else like that today, which we have today, which makes getting into comics actually easier now than it used to be. If you don't know precisely what's going on in the comic book that you have, or in the comic book collection that you have, I have a couple, you can always look it up on Wikipedia and fill in the details. That wasn't possible back then. I don't know precisely if Marvel had any fanzines at any point in its history, like Star Trek and some others did. So trying to get into Marvel Comics straight in the 90s, if you were a teenager, was very, very difficult unless you had a parent who was already into it, or an aunt or an uncle or a friend who could say, okay, no, this refers to that, this refers to that, and could help you get into the universe. So he did have a point. And the initial idea of setting up a new imprint, Ultimate Spider-Man, was a good one because it would have helped readers get into the mainstream Marvel universe. Each Marvel universe has its own number and sometimes its own name. Um, the number for the mainstream is 616. So if I say 616, that's what I mean.
Yeah, it's interesting what was happening there too, because if you've ever read, there was a series put out by a blogger, and I unfortunately don't know his real name, but he went by the blog username Man of Adam. That was a history series on Marvel Comics. Uh, in the history series on Marvel Comics, he went over like how Marvel sales started declining after Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and all of them retired, and they didn't really properly train the next wave. But there is a difference between them and DC. DC kind of kept declining; they never really revived properly again. And then there was this meteoric, dive in the '90s. However,
Yeah.
that did not happen with Marvel. Marvel started dropping, but then in the 80s they got a new editor, Jim Shooter. And
Hmm.
Jim Shooter was extremely unpopular with the Marvel creators, insisted on continuity. He needed to be continuity, not ignore it. This was hated by Marvel writers because it was a huge pain that they needed to
Anthony, you cut
that they
out too
weren't
much and
contradicting
we missed your point. Please
things.
repeat yourself.
No, I'm even using the good mic. So Jim Shooter was enforcing continuity at Marvel offices. Uh, what Jim Shooter did that was different than previous people or the previous editor by enforcing continuity made it so that things that happened in the comics mattered again. He was very unpopular among the writers in Marvel's in the I call it Marvel studio. It wasn't a studio, Marvel offices, I guess. He was very unpopular by the
Marvel
writers at
Comics,
the
yeah.
Marvel offices. Yeah, because he made it a lot more difficult for them to do their jobs because they needed to keep up and make sure that new story points weren't contradicting things that were already done. But this had one major effect on the comics. The things that happened now mattered. So if somebody was hurt, they had to remain hurt in future issues until you said that they were healed for some reason. If somebody died, they were dead, or at the very least, there were consequences to that death, since nobody permanently dies in comics.
Except for
And
Gwen
stuff like
Stacy,
that. And
Uncle Ben,
yeah,
and no longer Bucky Barnes.
no longer, well, as I think somebody pointed out that actually, as of now, it's technically like none of the three anymore. Except, I
If you
think, except on.
want to count alternate universes.
Yeah. Yeah, unless you count, if you don't count alternate universes. But anyway, except Uncle Ben. Poor Uncle Ben is just dead. You can't save him. Uh,
No.
he's just gone. Uh, anyway, though, the point being that this new focus on continuity in the Marvel comics, and I call it new, but it wasn't new. It was a return to what they were doing in the 60s. That's what made
Yeah.
Marvel so popular in the first place.
Hmm.
And that DC realized was a gold mine and tried to copy this continuity. And it actually caused a revival in Marvel sales. They briefly bounced back, but there was a problem, and the problem was that in the offices of Marvel Comics, they hated Jim Shooter. And you'll see Jim Shooter often called a divisive figure. I think that that's unfair. He was not a divisive figure. He was obviously and clearly a net positive for Marvel Comics. I mean, he saved the company from the ongoing collapse of the industry, or at least delayed it for a solid decade or so.
Yes.
Uh,
The
but
other thing he did too, and I'm gonna have to see if I can pull up the article, is he hired Christopher Priest, who brought back in the 1990s, roughly around 96, 97. I don't know where I tucked it, but he brought back he brought in Christopher Priest, who was a very good writer, did all his assignments on time, told great stories. The only problem was that when he was made an editor, he could not do the job. He was, and he knew he was bad at it. He hated being an editor, and he got so many complaints put against him that Shooter eventually had to call him in and say, "I'm sorry, but I have to fire you." At which point, let's see, I don't know where I put it. Anyway, at which point he looked at him and said, "Thank you for firing me." There it is. But it was Jim Shooter who pulled him up, who hired him. I shouldn't say pulled him up.
Yeah,
And
I'm looking at. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I'm just trying to find where it was.
So I am looking at Jim Shooter's page on Infogalactic at the moment, and it says that he was controversial because there was he imposed a dictatorial style on the bullpen. So, in other words, he was incredibly successful at everything that he did. He saved Marvel Comics, or at least staved off their demise for a decade, oversaw a turnaround in the company, helped to bring in some of the most talented creators in the history of Marvel Comics, including Frank Miller's legendary Daredevil run. But it was difficult to work for him. So, and I'm sure it was. Like, they're saying stuff like, he had strict adherence to deadlines. I mean, of course he did. Marvel was dying.
Well,
Uh,
and that's what editors are supposed to do anyway. They're supposed to make sure you meet the deadlines, particularly in a medium like comics or any kind of a serial where you have to churn it out at a certain rate. That's what web novels and chapters that you release online now, you have to be your own editor and make sure you make your deadlines and that you make your deadlines in such a way that your work looks good. If it doesn't look good, that reflects poorly on you and people don't come to read. The same thing happened, of course, with comics and well, we've seen the result.
yeah. So, like, it almost seems unfair to call him controversial. Like, I'm reading, John Byrne said, John Romita Sr. said Shooter had been great for the first 2 or 3 years. He got the creative people treated with more respect. Then the Secret Wars, blah, blah, blah. Then the Secret Wars was a big hit. And after that, he decided he knew everything and he started changing everybody's stuff. John Byrne said Shooter came along when Marvel needed him, but he stayed too long. Having fixed just about everything that was wrong, he could not stop fixing. So, like, and he was fired in 1987. Now, those are all great, and however, again, I think it's notable that that's coming from the creators who did not like him, but you can't argue with the results.
No, you can't. And the thing is, I'm trying to keep up here. I have several threads in my mind, but the thing is, too, that if they didn't like him hanging over their shoulder, it's quite possible that Shooter did keep tweaking things when they had already been fixed. Some people are like that. It's also quite possible that he had to stand over people and make sure that they did their work on time because otherwise they'd slack off.
Right,
So
like, it's hard for me
if
to
we're getting
say
in for
that, yeah, it's hard for me to say that Shooter's fault here when after he left, Marvel Comics basically collapsed. So clearly, everything was not fixed, or at the very least, the reason that everything was fixed was because Shooter was standing over everyone's shoulders, making sure that they were sticking to the rules.
and that they were delivering their work on time and cleaned up. And
Mm-hmm.
that's it's apparently Priest didn't have any problem with him from what I remember reading the article. I have the part here that It says, unfortunately, Priest wasn't as successful when he wasn't holding the writer's pen. His tenure as an editor was a disaster. I'll put the link, I saved that in the Discord so that Ben can post it up. It's a very interesting piece from Vulture, and I definitely recommend giving it a read. And if you can, find time to look up his run on Black Panther. It's an astounding run. I've managed to get to, I think I stopped at 15, issue 15, just because I got busy with other things and I couldn't keep up with it at the same time. But yeah, once once Shooter left, that was when Marvel started running off the rails when they hired Jamas, and he suggested rebooting the characters. Now, the initial plan, which they used to reboot them through an alternate universe and introduce people to them that way, actually worked very well. They took it straight from, and this was the name they had for the title before it was published, Ground Zero, where you start off with no backstory, no history. The world is the same world we live in. And then you start reintroducing the superheroes with their backgrounds. For Spider Man, this worked. When they did it with the X Men and the Ultimates, this universe's version of the Avengers, things went completely off the rails. Now, Bendis wasn't responsible for the Ultimates, at least at the start, or and he wasn't responsible for the X-Men at the start either. I think he might have been called in to write for both of them. The one who got called in for the Ultimates was Mark Miller. And
Yeah, I know Miller.
yeah, to the best of my knowledge, the Ultimates after a point were not well received because their characters were altered very significantly from where they had started in the comics. Originally, you had Captain America was more aggressive, uh, less knightly, and I'll come back to that at some point. But he was less patriotic and more soldierly in a very poor caricature of the American soldier, as he might have been pictured in the 40s and as he was probably pictured since at least Vietnam. Mark Miller openly described Thor as either a nutcase or a messiah, which doesn't make sense no matter how you slice it, because Thor was a neo-Arthurian interpretation of the original God of Thunder from Norse myth. Stan Lee even said that they went back to Norse myth in Marvel specifically because everybody and anybody was adapting Greek and Roman myth. And if everybody is saturated in that, just doing another version isn't going to get any attention. So he went to the Nordic and Norse myths instead. You can actually have a lot of fun there because some of the Valkyrie's horses in Marvel are named after Lord of the Rings characters. I think it's Brunhilde's Pegasus is named Aragorn. Someone else has a Pegasus named Galadriel, and so on and so forth. So they had a lot of fun with it, and then you come to the Ultimates. Uh, one of the nicest things that can be said about it is they had cool costume designs, cool art, and they that's about probably it. You had Hulk become an insecure genius, which okay, he was originally, but he also became a cannibal. He ate people. The Hulk was never a cannibal in the original comics, and this was the main problem with Marvel of the late 90s, mid to late 90s, and the early 2000s, and it came to a head in 2004 with Disassembled. Fans were very, very upset with this, primarily because it had overt continuity errors related to its main plot and the deaths and vilification of classic Avengers members. Now, the deaths in this case were okay. Some of the heroes needed to be pruned. Jack of Hearts, I think that was his name, was never a big character. Nobody really minds that he got blown up in the story. However, they managed to kill off Hawkeye, and he did have a strong fan base, still does. They killed off Vision, and they did a very bad job at handling Scarlet Witch. They made the sole Jewish Romani superheroine in Marvel basically a villain, and nobody liked this. The Ultimates' main purpose was to get people back into comics, but they were also decidedly not competing against other comics anymore. They were competing against television shows and movies. Television shows specifically like Buffy the Vampire Slayer is what one of the writers said. I think it might have been Miller.
Yeah,
So they
which is a
sold,
mistake.
yeah, it definitely is. The campiness might have needed to be toned down for a new generation. And yes, the continuity backstory made it hard in the 90s for people to get into the comics straight away, unless they were already part of a fan group or close by to one that could help them figure it out. But the problem, as I see it, is twofold. First and foremost, Marvel set out in the Ultimates and the Ultimate X-Men comics to deconstruct heroism. I'm going to take a slight break here and get some water so that I can wet my whistle.
Yeah, so I am not as familiar with the Ultimate comics, but I know that they really, really went off the rails at some point. In terms of their relation to modern comics, it's interesting. What the MCU does for its movies is it digs through the comics for things that they like, and then it cannibalizes them for various films, right? That's how the MCU works. So you get Guardians of the Galaxy, where their version of Star-Lord and the original version of Star-Lord are two completely different and unrelated characters, and their Guardians of the Galaxy is an entirely different style of Guardians of the Galaxy than any other type of Guardians of the Galaxy. So alternatively, too, you get like Captain America, bits and pieces of the backstory are changed. Nick Fury is the ultimate version of Nick Fury from the Ultimates line. He
Yes,
intentionally looks like Samuel L. Jackson. So the relation to the Ultimate comic seems to just be if they see something from Ultimates that they like, they use it. Because they don't really have any loyalty to any one line of the comics. This
actually,
is
for
why. Go ahead.
actually, from my perspective, and I am willing to admit that I might be wrong. From my perspective, the main through line for the first 8 years of Marvel Comics was the 616 universe, the one created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and all the others in the 1960s. They did adopt certain things from the Ultimates line, but that was mostly to streamline it and don't want to say purge or cancel, but tone down the campiness aspects of the original comics because, and this goes back to the flop that was the Batman and Robin movie. Part of the reason it flopped is it tried to keep the campiness at the same time it brought everything into a new generation, and the campiness didn't work in the 90s. The 90s were ticking down to cultural ground zero, yes, but at the same time, you can't expect something that worked in one era to work in another era. So the 90s were too different from the 60s for to have an Adam West style or a campy kind of superhero movie. And um, so that was the main thing. What the MCU would do is it would take the aesthetics, the sleek lines, if you will, of the Ultimate Comics, along with any tweaks that wouldn't alter the archetypes and the heroism of the characters as conceived in the 60s, and applied it to the movies to make it easier for anyone who hadn't been in the in the Marvel fandom from the 60s to the present, or who hadn't gotten into it at some point previous to the movies coming out, to have a better idea and a better experience without being thrown out of the film by why is Hawkeye wearing this Wolverine style mask and why is he wearing purple? You hardly notice the purple in Hawkeye's outfits in the movies, but the good thing is that it's there. In the Ultimate Comics, he wears red. at least to start with. His initial suit, which is the one you see in the Avengers, starts out with a red motif instead of a purple motif. And although it's toned down for the MCU, he is wearing purple. Very important distinction, because one of the things they did in the Ultimate Comics was they made him not only they made him a shield agent, they made him a shield agent to escape jail time for, by the sounds of it, a murder. And after his family is killed in the Ultimate Comics, he becomes a murderer. This is in stark contrast to the 616 universe, where Hawkeye is very reluctant to shoot to kill. In some eras of the comics history, he has a strict no kill policy. Bendis waffled back and forth on this in the mid 2000s when he was writing for the Avengers. And sometimes Hawkeye would actually have a bloodlust. Sometimes he'd go back to his 1980s standard of do not kill. And this is where the deconstruction part comes in.
So, in
Because
terms oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
sorry,
Go
no, you
ahead.
first.
Yeah, in terms of what's going on with the modern MCU, so I think you're right. I think in the early days they went with the '60s through line of the MC of Marvel Comics, but I
Hmm.
would argue that the reason that they did that is because they were obviously better than the modern comics, and at the beginning era, the early era of the MCU, they couldn't really afford to take risks, right? Like what
Yeah.
people forget, I think nowadays, or a lot of people sometimes forget, is that Iron Man was a big risk of a film. Superhero movies were not automatic moneymakers. In
Mm-mm.
fact, they were considered kind of box office, poison. Robert Downey Jr. was an extremely risky choice to play the lead
He
because,
actually wasn't even on the short list. He showed up and said, "You don't understand. I am Iron Man." They kept trying to get him to leave, and he wouldn't go away. So they said, "Okay, fine. Film some test scenes with him and make him shut up and go away." Then when they went back and reviewed the footage, they found out nobody else but him would fit the part.
yeah, because Robert Downey Jr. was he was known as an excellent actor. He had, I believe, either won or been nominated for an Academy Award at that point for his portrayal of Charlie Chaplin in the movie Chaplin. But he was a drug addict who had ended up in jail recently, or relatively recently. And he was considered just a big risk to work with. Like, you don't know how he's going to affect the production. Drug addicts are notorious about relapsing. What if he relapses? How do we know he's reliable? Uh, all sorts of issues of that nature were going on with Robert Downey Jr. So Iron Man was a big risk as a project, right? And
Yeah.
the first MCU films, the first three, there's a reason they did essentially the three most popular properties that they currently had, or at least two of the three, because Iron Man was a little bit lesser known. Spider-Man was not, of course, under their control. It was under
Right.
Sony's, so they couldn't do Spider-Man, but they intentionally, played it safe. And then, everybody makes such a big deal about Endgame, but Avengers was Endgame before Endgame, right? It was,
Hmm.
when Avengers was coming out, the word around Avengers was almost exactly the same. Like, how are they going to pull this off? It's incredibly ambitious. Nobody's ever done this before. Blah, blah, blah. Luckily, they got Joss Whedon in, and Joss Whedon had done team up films before. He had sort of a trial run at this type of film in Serenity, which I think is excellent. Uh, admittedly, Joss Whedon is now persona non grata, and I do not like Joss Whedon as a person. Would not defend him as a person.
No.
He's also a notorious SJW, but the man can write
Yeah.
if he wants to. If he decides to take it seriously, he can write. And Avengers is a film that's so meticulously crafted. You could teach how to you could teach how to write a screenplay using Avengers as a model.
Hmm.
Every single moment of Avengers is included for a very specific reason, perfectly pushing the story forward. Every second of it either establishes plot, advances character, or both. It is an immaculately constructed screenplay. And that's Joss Whedon, right? Like, that's entirely Joss Whedon. The way that he handles these big ensemble casts is his bread and butter. Uh, they all come across as very in character. So this early MCU, I I guess what I'm trying to get at is I think you're right that they followed the 60s, but I think the reason that they followed the 60s is because they knew that that's what worked and they weren't interested in taking risks yet. So later, we get in phase 2, now they could take a few more risks, but they're still trying to do something, right? They have a plan. You know, that's the big thing about Marvel. That's also what made the early Marvel comics good. Why the Jim
Yeah.
Shooter era worked and the post Jim Shooter era didn't. Why the Stan Lee era worked. Because they had men in charge. In this case, it was Kevin Feige. Go ahead.
Yeah, they had Kevin. I really don't know how to pronounce his last name.
No, I
Um,
don't either.
but they had him in charge, and they also one of the great things about Joss Whedon is he grew up reading the comics, the 60s ones, the mainstream 616 series. So he knew these characters. He actually wanted to stick closer to Hawkeye's original 1960s introduction for the Avengers. It was cut to make it streamlined. They were too worried. It was a big risk anyway. So they insisted he cut that out, and that's how we end up with so little of Hawkeye in the movie. We originally would have gotten more. It's also interesting because although he does not necessarily agree with Captain America, Whedon arguably gives him the most screen time. If you actually go back and look at IMDb and one of their trivia links on the movie, they point out that Cap is the one with the most screen time in the film, and he would have had more if a few of the cutscenes, I shouldn't say cutscenes, scenes that were cut had been kept in the film. But they were trying to go for something streamlined, something that everybody could follow. So these scenes, which aren't necessary to the overall narrative, but would have been nice from a fan perspective and from uh, a, a, a character perspective to see, were left out. If honestly, everybody's gaga over the Snyder cut of Justice League. No, I want the Whedon cut of the Avengers movies. The
Yeah,
other
the
thing,
Snyder Cut of Justice League is an interesting topic of discussion. So Mahler did a long, like, I want to say 2 or 4 hour analysis of the Snyder Cut, where he made the argument that the Snyder Cut is actually not noticeably better than the Whedon Cut. You only think it is because you really want it to be. uh, I have not seen either version. I have absolutely no interest in that Justice League movie. I
me
did
neither.
not think the Superman movie was good, or I scratch that. I thought it was passably okay. And that's it. I did not watch the Wonder Woman movie. Just I've heard it's good from people I trust, but and I'm sure it is, but I have no interest in it. And they clearly moved into that Justice League movie way too fast without doing the proper groundwork. Uh, so I just don't have any interest in it. However, with that said, Mahler's analysis of it sounded awfully plausible to me. I'll only throw it out that way. One of the main points he was making was that if you really pay attention, you'll notice that we're not actually watching the quote unquote Snyder cut of the film. So the implication of the Snyder cut is that Zack Snyder uh, had his own version of the movie that Joss Whedon took over and then Whedoned up, and it ruined Snyder's vision. But now Snyder can give us his real vision. Only, as Mahler was pointing out, and I think that the case he made was pretty strong, that's actually not what we got. Instead, what we got was Zack Snyder's version of the film after seeing the fan backlash to Whedon's cut,
Hmm.
which is a different thing. In other words, he said, hey, they don't like this version of Flash, then I could change that up a little bit. They don't like his outfit, then I could change it. They don't like this, they don't like that. That isn't to say that's what Snyder originally would have done. And if you think that's what he originally would have done, you are being fooled by the propaganda around the Snyder cut. I think
Don't
it was an interesting point he made. Mahler had a
it
few interesting
is.
things to say about generally modern Marvel and modern superhero movies. One of his great ones, he has an excellent review, highly recommended, of Black Widow. And I've seen people sometimes criticize Mahler for being hyper focused on plot holes and ignoring, like, the moral dimension of the movies. And Well, I understand the criticism because he gets very nitpicky, which he admits himself that he likes doing that, so that's why he does it. I don't think this is a fair case all of the time. This is a fair criticism all of the time. So, in Mahler's critique of Black Widow, he really did put his finger on what was the actual fundamental problem of the movie. Now, the Black Widow movie is a colossal disaster. Uh, it is totally nonsensical. It makes no sense. Like, so many issues. They just cascade on each other, right? But the real problem with the Black Widow movie, if you really pay attention to it, is that the creators of the film do not understand the difference between right and wrong.
which
And they
fall
are trying to make movies that have already been established in a universe where right and wrong exists. So you can't
hmm
just get rid of it completely, right? You can't just go, well, no, this is a morally gray world like Watchmen or The Boys. Now, I have my issues with those films too, but credit where it's due. They at least keep a consistent, there's a consistency in their worldview. Well, you
hmm
can't do, MCU Watchmen or an MCU The Boys because they already have a moral order established. The problem is that Black Widow was written by people who do not understand what this moral order is or how it works. Black Widow's entire character was founded upon her guilt over the horrible things that she did as a widow. It haunts her. She has red in the ledger. She wants to wipe it out. Right? That's like our
Yep.
introduction to the character. That's why she worked for S.H.I.E.L.D. And then that's also why she left S.H.I.E.L.D. with Steve, because she realized that S.H.I.E.L.D. was no longer the good guys, if they ever were, and that she could not be morally working for them. Everything about this character is based on getting rid of that red in her ledger, all the way up to her death.
Yep.
Everything. So
hmm
when we meet her in the Black Widow when we see her in the Black Widow movie, at one point they're trying to rescue Red Guardian from a jail. At this point in the film, they bury the entire jail in an avalanche, and that means that all of the prisoners and all of the guards are very likely dead. And if they are not dead, it is through sheer luck. It has nothing to do, like, they certainly appear to be dead. Natasha does not seem to care if they're dead or not. Now, Mahler points out in the review that this is a fundamental betrayal of Black Widow's character. She would
Yep.
not do this. It does not make sense. It is inconsistent. And as he also put it, and let me be clear. Let me be clear. If you think that she deserves it because they are guards or because they are prisoners, then you have less moral sense than Postman Pat. And he is correct.
Yes.
It is absolutely ludicrous. At one point they take that red in the ledger line and they turn it into a joke. Red Guardian looks at her at one point and says, "Your ledger must be gushing red. I've never been more proud of you." Now, like, it's sort of a funny line in context, or, out of context, I should say. Like, I guess it's a funny joke. Like, the Red Guardian thinks that the fact that she's a master assassin is a good thing because he's a master assassin. That's kind of what they do, whatever. But it doesn't really work because it's so fundamental to Black Widow's character. You've now turned her character into a joke.
Yes.
Like,
That's
that's the point of that scene. Now, the entire basis of who Black Widow is, her motivation, is a joke. Go ahead.
yes. And this it leads into the other part of why Marvel's grasp of heroism in and out of the comics in the MCU is falling apart. Actually, it's no longer extant. The thing about um, all the characters in Marvel, if you look at them closely, you will see that they are based on archetypes in the past. Now, most people immediately go to the classics with the ancient Greeks, but the thing is, you could actually go back, and I'm starting off with the X Men here. You can go back to the legends of King Arthur. Cyclops is a young King Arthur, and it's very obvious in the way that he's set up as the leader of the X-Men. When the X-Men start out, they're teenagers led by Professor Xavier, who is Merlin. They have set up a sort of secret Camelot in the X Mansion, and they are bringing They are standing around a round table. In some adaptations, like the 90s cartoon, they had an actual round table in their war room. They're based upon these archetypes, and these archetypes have some very specific things about them. They all they are all aiming at a specific moral high. That's not the right word. A specific moral. They all have a specific moral code, and they are all aiming at heaven. Essentially, they have specific moral virtues embedded in their characters. These are the archetypes, plain and simple. Now, the difference with the X-Men compared to the Legends of King Arthur is that they're an Americanized version with teenagers to start with, later with adults who have superpowers instead of the various virtue based or grace based or even magic based powers that the Knights of the Round Table had. Cyclops is the young King Arthur who does not pull the sword from the stone, but he is the most qualified to lead. So that's why Professor X, in his position as Merlin, names him the leader of the team. Now the thing about archetypes is that they're less narrowly defined than psychological research, whereas you can have entire books written about the human psyche, and we do have those. They are a rather dry form of an endeavor. You can read them and gain a lot from them, but I think it was C.S. Lewis said, you cannot, I think it was, you cannot study man, your fellow man, you can only get to know him. Archetypes allow you to get to know someone. Yes, you can synthesize all these things about a specific archetype into a list of uh, traits and things. But at the end of the day, what an archetype does for a writer is it's a skeleton that you can hang your character and his personality on. What does he want? What's he doing? Why does he want this? You get to G.K. Chesterton says it in the introduction to the Ballad of the White Horse. You get to look through his hood, through his eyes, and so instead of a puppet on strings, you're standing almost on the shoulder of your character, looking out at the world as he would look out at it. That's what they do. Now, psychological analyses have their place with a writer, especially these days. But the thing is, at the end of the day, a reader of stories does not come for a psychological treatise. This is why Jordan Peterson always illustrates his talks, whether you like the man or not. He always illustrates his talks about various psychological aspects of the human mind by using he goes back to fairy tales. He goes back to Pinocchio, he goes back to Cinderella, to Beauty and the Beast, and he uses these to illustrate points because people might not know what a cluster B personality is. A cluster B personality, just for everybody's edification, it's a group of personality disorders, atypical ways of thinking about oneself and relating to other people. And cluster B disorders are usually marked by inappropriate, volatile emotionality and often unpredictable behavior. This covers antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and the big one, narcissistic personality disorder. Now, if you've dealt with a narcissist and you read the description in a psychiatric book about how they work, you'll see the differences. But not everybody deals with a narcissist and not everybody recognizes them. But if you see someone with narcissistic tendencies in a story, you're going to be able to pin down and say, okay, that person is bad and this is why. Or if you can't pin it down, explain why you can understand it, you understand it instinctively because it's not at a distance, which is what psychiatric descriptions of the problem do, is they kind of put a sort of glass wall between you and the other person. Stories give you a more visceral understanding, immediate, right now in your face. So this is what archetypes do for people. Once you hang the character on an archetype, everything flows smoothly because now people know what to expect from it. And the problem with Marvel is that they fell in the they fell down the rabbit hole of naturalism. Naturalism was a movement in fiction in the late 19th century, and it was a reaction, late 19th century, early 20th century, and it was a reaction against two previous uh, movements in fiction. One was Romanticism, which essentially made man a god. It talked about how all evil resolves itself into goodness, so evil isn't real. We all become one in the end. One over. This was known as the Oversoul. In this type of, it was a quasi religion. There were some nominally Christian denominations that embraced this idea. Well, this type of romanticism, once it crashes against real life, falls apart because you cannot say evil is not real. People try, even now, to get around it and excuse it, but it is very much in your face, very real. So, in order to counteract this, the lies of romanticism, realism was started as a movement, and this stripped away all the spiritual aspects in fiction of mankind. And this had a problem because it would start a story with a wedding and end a story with the couple bickering. So nobody wants to read that. That's just a picture of real life. We read fiction or watch it or somehow or other engage with it to escape real life and find some relief and perhaps even some answers to our own problems. Naturalism took realism to its logical conclusions away from romanticism. Natural, where romanticism says everything, even evil, resolves into the ultimate good, the oversoul. Naturalism says we all end up howling in a meaningless void where only the strong, the Ubermensch, or Superman, reign supreme, and even they're eventually brought low by the inevitable effects of entropy. We all die. Essentially, nothing matters. Where romanticism worships man and turns him into a god, naturalism worships death. It's nihilism. Marvel may have been one of the first franchises to really be infected and fall to this problem. It's because it spread throughout, especially in the 90s at cultural ground zero, it spread throughout the rest of fiction and the rest of the franchises. If you go back and look at it, and that's why I started out with the comics, you can see where the shift starts to come in and change. And this is where we get the woke and the death cult, as it's alternatively called by some, parading all these zombies of our favorite franchises in front of our faces. This is where you get The Last Jedi. This is where you get The Rings of Power that's coming out soon. This is where you get Multiverse of Madness, Black Widow, and almost all the other movies and stories that have come out since Endgame.
Yeah,
They de- they
sorry, go
deconstruct
ahead.
heroism and reduce it to nothing matters. There's no heaven and or hell. There's only an empty void. You can't get out of it. And to do this, to make that idea stick, they had to alter the characters to fit this. This is where you end up with uh, Hulk becoming a cannibal, uh, and the Ultimate X-Men comics. The reason Professor X has Jean on is he's attracted to her. And I'm sorry, that's gross, but they added it anyway and called it more realistic character development, whereas you had the original idea was she was the Guinevere to Cyclops' young King Arthur. But they're different from their progenitors in the archetype in that Psyche is not brash or proud in the same way as Arthur. He's not running out to battle. He's stoic, he's reserved, and he's controlling because he can't control his eye beams. So to compensate for that, he tries to control everything else, which is one of the reasons why he's always at odds with Wolverine. Now, Wolverine technically fills the Lancelot position, even though he's not as cultured or nigh perfect as Lancelot. In fact, one of his writers in the past once characterized Wolverine as I think it was failed samurai. So he's basically a broken knight. Jean is caught in the middle of these two. She's got the fire to Cyclops' stoic calm and coolness, um, but she never, despite Wolverine's best attempts, she never changes her attitude. She says, "No, I'm in love with Cyclops." And sometime, a couple of times, she cut loose into Wolverine and told him in no uncertain terms, "Stop it! I don't love you. I can't. I love you as a friend, but I cannot love you as the way that I love Cyclops." And so this is where they are expansions or Americanizations of their original archetypes in the Legends of King Arthur. So,
See, that's interesting about the X-Men, because I did not know that there was a King Arthur connection to the X-Men.
well, it's something you have to kind of look at it and kind of, because I haven't seen anybody else say this. This is something I got from looking at the cartoons and the comics, and then looking back further. I, as far as I know, no one else has compared them to the Legends of King Arthur, which is a shame. But these are all archetypes that point straight at heaven, that say, yes, morality exists, objective morality exists, objective truth exists. You cannot deny it. Uh, whether you believe in it or not doesn't matter. It is there. You try and ignore it, you try and avoid it, you're going to ram against it like a car going 60 miles an hour hitting a wall. It's not going to bend. You are. It's not going to break. You are. This is what the Ultimate Comics, and particularly in the 616 universe, disassembled. There have been issues previous. There had been issues previous to that, I would say, in some of the storylines. But Disassembled was the big one in 2004, and it's why fans reacted very poorly to it, and it had to be retconned, and the retcons actually made things worse, in my opinion. It's also worth pointing out that the callbacks to the Legends of King Arthur don't stop with the X-Men. They actually continue on with the Avengers, particularly Captain America. If Cyclops is a young King Arthur, named to lead the new Camelot, where humans and mutants learn to coexist, whereas in the Legends of King Arthur, they were dedicated to uniting England and making it a golden age where civilization flourished. Then Captain America is the returned King Arthur. Avalon and the Legends of King Arthur, at the end, when Arthur is mortally wounded, he's taken to Avalon, and it is said that he will return to England when his country most needs him and lead it into battle. Now, there's people have tried several times to bring King Arthur back to lead England, and they always run into a couple of problems. When you bring Arthur back, you've got to have a very big threat to England for it to work. The biggest threat anyone can think of is probably the apocalypse or the post-apocalypse. And the only way
Yeah,
to
this is a I'm trying to think of the way to put this. This is a pet idea of mine, right? Like King Arthur and King Arthur stuff, which is why the stuff that you're talking about with the X-Men as types of Arthur are interesting. One of the versions of this, Return of King Arthur that I read, and it's probably one of the better ones, actually, and I'm just going by this because of the author. Uh, an author named Stephen Lawhead, highly recommended, has a brilliant series called the Pendragon Cycle. The first 5 books in the Pendragon Cycle are about King Arthur in the time of King Arthur. So,
Mhm.
the Pendragon Cycle is, let me think, Taliesin, Merlin, Arthur, Pendragon, and Grail. Those are the first 5. All good books, highly recommended. I enjoy them. The 6th book, however, was called Avalon, and Avalon is not a bad book by any stretch. It is very readable, it was entertaining, and I don't think anybody could call it, like, an actually terrible book. But it was quite disappointing to me. So the plot of Avalon, you could probably guess by both our topic and by the title, is about the return of King Arthur. and it takes place in modern day England. I can't remember the exact year, but just generic modern day, sometime in like either the 90s or 2000s, whenever the book came out. I don't recall. Uh, and in Avalon, the impetus for Arthur's return is that the monarchy of Britain is on the verge of being voted out. So, and Merlin returns and they find like a new heir who's, they get the documentation to prove that there is a new heir to the throne who was like hidden away, and he's actually like the rightful king, and that's the plot of the book. And then he needs to convince them not to vote out the monarchy, and Morgana shows up briefly. So Avalon is is not a bad book. Again, it's well done, it's well constructed, and Stephen Lawhead is a good writer. But I
Hmm.
was very disappointed by it when I read it for the reason that you're saying. I was like, so Arthur is supposed to come back at Britain's hour of greatest need. Like, that's the legend, right?
Hmm.
The greatest possible moment, the worst thing that could happen to Britain. That's when Arthur returns.
Hmm.
And what he came up with was the figurehead monarchy, because let's be real here, right? The current monarchy of Great Britain is a figurehead monarchy. The figurehead monarchy of Great Britain is going to be legally voted out. And that's his pick for this is the
Hmm.
conflict. Not World War II, right? Not World War One. Not any of the various horrible things, civil wars and things that happened throughout England's history, but the figurehead monarchy is going to disappear. Like, why? He tried to make it. I think there's even a line. A character says, "Why do we even care?" And Merlin gets mad and says, "If anybody agrees with that comment, then leave this room right now." But I kind of agree with it. Why do you care? Like,
What is this doing for England specifically?
yeah, like it's not exact, like he talks about like instituting social Lawhead's very vague about it. Like, the new Arthur talks about instituting social reforms, meeting with the prime minister weekly, you know. And that
Yeah.
but it's still like how much of an effect is he going to have that's that important? Like, the it's so important that this is the moment that Arthur has to return. This bothered me so much that I started work on my own series and actually published a book in it that's unfortunately off the market right now. About like what, because my theory was that I need to come up with a conflict that's so bad Arthur would need to return. So,
Hmm.
uh, it was set in a post-apocalyptic Britain where like an there was a war, an EMP knocked out all of the electronics. Then there was a war, and then it was set like 1,000 years into the future. And the main characters came from a city called New Washington. They were like the descendants of American tourists.
Mm.
And invaders had showed up, and magic was returning to Britain. And that's when the new Arthur arose. Because I was like, this is a proper conflict where you would go, things got so bad, you need Arthur to come back. John C. Wright's take on the subject is like you said, well, what's the moment Arthur would need to return? The worst thing, the apocalypse. And John C. Wright in his Moth and Cobweb series is clearly implying that Arthur will be sleeping until the end of the world,
Yeah.
which is a perfectly logical deduction to make, right? If he hasn't come back for World War II, that
Yeah.
seems pretty existential. So what could it be? Well, the end of the world, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And
This was a big tangent and all. However, I just found it really interesting. You nailed what I already saw as one of the big problems with Return of Arthur stories.
no, no, actually, it's very topical to to the point because Captain America is not just a returned King Arthur. He is also primarily the American Galahad. Galahad in the Legends of King Arthur is the perfect knight, the one who can sit in the Siege Perilous and not get fried, the one who finds the Holy Grail, the only knight to find the Holy Grail, the only knight to receive directly from Christ's side the Eucharist, after which point he dies because you've just received the Eucharist from the Christ child. What else is there for you to live for? Now, Captain America, this is where Stan who loved fairy tales. He even mentions it in the introduction for, I have it here, the Marvel Masterworks #3 for the Avengers, in the lead up to an adventure the team has with Kang the Conqueror, who is a descendant in the 30th century of Doctor Doom, and who in that particular issue was romancing the Princess Ravana. Um, I might read the part he said there later. But Stan was a big fan of fairy tales. So it's not necessarily surprising that unconsciously or consciously he'd draw on the legends of King Arthur. Captain America is the ideal American, the same way that Galahad is the ideal English Christian knight. He embodies all the ideals we were supporting in World War II. Now, was World War II a war we should have gotten into? Anything like that is beside the point. What the point is, this is what Cap represents. He represents the best ideals of the United States as a country. They're all united in his person in the course of the story. And that is his point. So, to avoid the post-apocalyptic setting, Stan, who was always fascinated by Captain America and tried to revive him because as the war wound down, Cap initially started as a propaganda piece and he was meant primarily to help inspire the troops during the war. Most of the comic book sales for Captain America comics in World War II were overseas by the guys in the war. They weren't sold to kids stateside. The kids on the stateside did not make up the biggest demographic of buyers. So the thing is, he tried in the 1950s to bring him back as the commie smasher. Stan, and he might have been tapping into the zeitgeist of the time, because in the 50s, the big fear was the communists, the Soviets, the communist Chinese, but primarily the Soviets, because we'd given them the atom bomb. So he was tapping into that, and that ties in with Black Widow, which we'll get to in a minute. Since we weren't having a post-apocalyptic setting, and the campiness even then from the Captain America comics of the 40s wasn't carrying over in the 50s, Dan had to let Steve lapse. But he found a new way to bring him back in the 1963 fourth issue of The Avengers.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you briefly to point out that this is one of the reasons that I absolutely love the movie Winter Soldier.
Hmm.
Captain America Winter Soldier. It's probably my favorite of the MCU films, though it is close. There are several contenders, but Winter Soldier is always at the top of my personal list. And one of the reasons I absolutely adore Winter Soldier is that it manages the astonishingly difficult, and if you've ever tried to do this, as I have, just in general course of being a writer, and I'm sure that you've had to do at some points as well in your writing, it has managed the astonishingly difficult work of making Captain America doubt who he was working for, what he was doing, everything he did, without either casting doubt on the morality of Captain America himself or casting doubt on the idea that there were good guys and were bad guys. There is a world of good and evil, and it all comes to a head. And I don't want to get too far off because I interrupted you here, and I meant to mention this briefly, but it all comes to a head in the wonderful scene where they try to order them to I forget I'm blanking on like what the exact plot was, but they have the scene where they try to order everybody in the building to do something nefarious, and then she says captain's order, and he gives the famous captain's orders line.
Yeah,
I won't listen to you, captain's orders. It's a
right.
great moment because it's about how the people of the country and the leadership of the country are separate, right?
Yeah.
Captain America represents the true spirit of America, and the captain's orders line is about how, even with the leadership of America at that point thoroughly converged towards evil, the spirit of
Hmm.
America is not yet dead. It's just
Yeah, and
wonderful. I love Winter Soldier, and it's such a I don't think you could really appreciate. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how difficult what they accomplished in that movie was.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's the Captain America movies are spectacular because they never compromise the fact that he is Galahad. And this Professor Geek actually points out on his channel, if you haven't seen his channel over on YouTube, he points out that one of the great things about Captain America and the Avengers is they are meant to be thoroughly American heroes. And America, for most of its history, has seen itself as a Christ like figure in the world. Now, you can argue about whether or not that's a good thing. The fact is, it's part of our national psyche, our national mythos. And the thing is, European countries had this same idea of themselves at some point or another. England definitely had it, so we inherited that, if you want to argue it
Yeah,
that way.
it is a comment that
But
John C. Wright made that's notable, which is that every war in America's history was moral. And I agree with John. Not what he was saying. So, to be clear, what John was saying was not that America was morally in the right in every war, which would be an absurd comment for
yes,
obvious reasons. What John was actually saying was that for America to justify every war, America needed to present to the public a moral dimension, or else the people were not interested. Like, why do you think, the fact that false flags are such a part of so many wars in the nation's history is actually notable here? The most famous, of course, is the Spanish American War and the Remember the Maine, but that's a perfect example. Other countries would have justified going in and fighting Mexico or sorry, fighting Mexico, Spain, fighting Spain because, they wanted that territory and they were powerful enough to get it and they didn't want Spain there. And it would have been relatively easy to justify on those grounds, but that's not enough for America. America needed to pretend, even though it's a lie, though admittedly that did not come out until much longer later. The American public certainly didn't know it, and the press did not report it. Even though it was a lie, they needed a moral dimension in order to justify the war, because America is very important to the American psyche that we are the good guys. Like,
yes,
there is a moral dimension to the way that we view our conflicts with the world. We need to be the good guys. Yeah, we
kept that.
don't like being the good guy.
Yeah, and they kept that for Winter Soldier, where the entire idea of the Project Insight is, well, we can defend all the world and we won't even have to get our hands dirty. And Cap, this is the grand thing about Cap, and it's amazing that they did not compromise on him until Endgame. He points out this isn't freedom, this is fear. And the thing about fear is it makes you easy to control. And that was why he was against it. Who is controlling you if you are always afraid? That's also the other part of his original appearance in his own first movie. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from. Steve never shows fear. Fear is running away. Peggy Carter even asks him this. She says, did you have something against running away? If you start running, they'll never let you stop. And that's also part of the American spirit is no, we're not going to run away. We're not going to be the world's lapdog. You can kick us, you can beat us, you can spit on us, you can break our bones. We can do this all day. And the thing is, Cap is the embodiment of that ideal of the American spirit. Is it irretrievable? God only knows, but we shouldn't throw it away. And Cap is the reminder, somewhat more than Superman, though Superman serves this way too. But Cap is the reminder of this, as Galahad was. He is, in a manner of speaking, the conscience of the mythological or uh, image that America has of itself, and he always points true north. This is why they're actively stomping on him and trying to destroy him in the comics. It started in the comics, which, since they were drawing on the 16 universe for the most part in the original MCU movies, I knew this was eventually going to happen if we weren't careful and if the wrong people got in charge. And it unfortunately unfolding right in front of our eyes, because once they stopped, there's room for experimentation. This is not the same thing. Once you break an archetype, it's like Gandalf and Saruman in the Fellowship of the Ring. He says, white will do as a start, Saruman says. Why? But the white light can be broken. the white page overwritten, and now I am Saruman of many colors. And he steps back, and Gandalf sees that his robe, which is initially supposed to be white because he is Saruman the White, shimmers all these different colors of the rainbow. And Gandalf's response, I liked white better. He also comes to say, Saruman, you know what that to break a thing is to leave up the path of wisdom. And that's the fact that they're trying to break all of these archetypes in comics, which they might have been a bit campy and a bit fantastic and a bit wild. And yes, okay, streamlining would work and be helpful. The thing is, that's not what these changes were made for. To change, even when they say they want to reboot the characters in order to make them easier for people to get in line with, well, you were doing that with Ultimate Spider Man in a way that actually worked. What you did with the Ultimates and the Ultimate X Men is something different entirely. You said you were being surprising or being more realistic. But what you were really doing was you were holding out a carrot to the original fans and the new fans on a stick. And you tempt them forward with the carrot on the stick, and maybe they get to the carrot, you thwack them with the stick. Or they bite into the carrot and they find out it's Play-Doh. And these writers are sitting back laughing and pointing, aren't you stupid?
Mm-hmm.
You fell for the trick. And that is wrong. That's abuse. It's abuse of the audience, and it's abuse meant to make the writer appear stronger, better, smarter, what have you, than they actually are. Doesn't matter if the only thing they get off of on this is watching us suffer. They know we love these things. They know we love these characters. They know we love these archetypes. And it's like the schoolyard bully seeing you playing in your sandbox. He takes your shovel and snaps it over his knee. Why? Not because he didn't like the way you were shoveling sand or anything. He might say that, but because you were having a good time and he was not. And he wanted to rain on your parade. It's like the abusive parents who, if they find out that you're playing with this or that toy or reading this or that book, come in, tear it up right in front of you, or uh, another image of that would be Ever After, the movie with Demi. I can't remember her name. It was a Cinderella retelling, and at one point, she has to choose between her father's book or her mother's shoes. This is the scene that we see in the Disney movie where they rip her dress. They rip her dress not because they rip her dress to spite her. And in the movie Ever After, it was either the book or the shoes got thrown in the fire, not because the shoes were ugly or dirty, but simply and specifically to hurt Ella. It was, and this is the same thing. And this is why alternatives like My Hero Academia, and you've mentioned this yourself, are doing so well. It's not just that they're exotic, it's not just that the superhero comics of the West have fallen, it's that is that Horikoshi specifically makes sure to carry through on the archetypes and tropes. He never abandons the moral imperative. He never plays a gotcha moment. He actually lets you have the carrot. He doesn't beat you with the stick. He doesn't replace the carrot with Play-Doh. The two of the audience and the writer in this case are in a mutual game or dance. He's leading you around and you're having fun being led around because you trust him. You trust him to have a point and to play with you honestly. These writers are not playing the game honestly. They are technically not playing fair.
Right.
And they're
And
doing it
what?
on purpose specifically to hurt the viewers. If
Yes,
anything,
that's completely
Horikoshi's
correct.
real genius is that he blends the Eastern and Western archetypes so seamlessly because it's the right shonen archetypes and they're not violated, and it's the right American superhero and by extension European archetypes taken straight through. He doesn't renege on his promises or anything else like that.
Yes, and this is one of the things that makes I mean, My Hero Academia, we've had multiple streams on, and we probably will again because My Hero Academia is nearing its end game at the moment. In fact, it's really in the middle of its endgame, which, by the way,
Mhm.
I am okay with. I think that good stories need endings. So, the fact that My Hero Academia is at its ending, while I will miss the series, I think that's good that it's coming to a proper end. Uh, with that said, like there's another good example of this from Japanese media, and I mentioned this to you. I think when we first, tried to come up with an idea for what to do for a live stream, cough cough, giving all of our listeners some inside baseball on how these live streams work. I say, hey, Ben won't be there. Anybody want to do a live stream? And then I wait and see who volunteers. And that is how we come up with live stream ideas. It's all very scientific. Anyway, uh, oh, good, we got comments. So before I get to my point, I'll read Bradford's comments. So we got Bradford Walker. Hi, Bradford. You don't deliberately break a mythical archetype unless you're aiming to break a culture in order to replace it with another. What do they want to replace Cap's archetype with? Find out what archetype they want to install in its place, and you find out who seeks to rule over you. That is a
Thing
good
is, they haven't been able to replace it. They've tried it with
Yeah,
Sam
that's what I was
Wilson, and
thinking.
they've tried it with everything else. The answer is nothing.
So to get back to what I was, and you're absolutely right. But to get back to what I was saying, there's another superhero comic here that is worth talking about, and that is the comic One Punch Man. So One Punch Man is sometimes compared to Deadpool. Specifically, the YouTuber ER has a video series comparing it to Deadpool, where he claims One Punch Man is superior. He also thinks, and this seems to be fan consensus, that One Punch Man is better than My Hero Academia. I think that's arguable, but I don't think that's a slam dunk. I personally prefer My Hero Academia for various reasons, but I understand why somebody would say that. Uh,
Mhm.
the thing about One Punch Man, though, that makes it so brilliant is that One Punch Man is in, and I mention this every few weeks or so, but it's important, so I'm going to keep talking about it. It's in that category of storytelling called reconstructions, decon recons. I'm sure there is an official TV tropes term for this. I never bothered to learn it because I don't really like TV tropes much. Uh, but essentially, what the decon recon is, it takes a certain type or genre of story, deconstructs it, meaning that it breaks it down and shows that story type to be either ridiculous or dumb or unrealistic in some manner, and then reconstructs it, shows that all of those arguments that you use to deconstruct it don't actually work, and it's a great type of story. This has been done multiple times to great effect in the superhero genre. One of my all-time favorite movies ever is The Incredibles, which is a perfectly executed decon recon and a brilliant film. In fact, I would argue that the decon recon is one of the things that makes the film so great. For example, I've seen people criticize The Incredibles for ending with a big bombastic action scene when it didn't really have to, and they're talking about the robot battle, but I actually disagree with that. I think that that was necessary for the structure of the film, because The Incredibles was actually a decon recon of two different things. It was a deconstruction of superhero films and superhero comics and superheroes generally, and it was a deconstruction of families, just families generally, and what the purpose and meaning of a family was, what it meant to have a family, whether family should be mocked or celebrated. It was about that as well. And the superhero battle, the big bombastic superhero fight scene at the end was necessary because it was ultimately about both of those things. And you needed to have a scene that shows just how awesome superheroes could be if you play the concept straight. And the fight scene with the Omnidroid at the end of the film is an absolutely incredible fight scene. Uh, really just like one of the best, and it needed to be because that's part of the point of the movie. Part of the point of the movie is that actually superheroes are awesome. So here's why. Uh, Similarly in comics, in the Decon Recon subcategory, you get Daredevil Born Again, which is my absolute favorite superhero comic. John Delarose dislikes it because of what they do to Karen Page in the comic, I know. He has mentioned this to me. Sorry, John. I'm calling you out if you listen to this stream. Don't worry, we still love you here on the Superversive live stream. Uh, However, he claimed he was not a fan of Daredevil Born Again because he thought it was kind of gross how they treated Karen Page. However, what I think that John was not properly appreciating was a couple of things. Number one is that Karen Page was actually not that important of a part of the Daredevil mythos at that point. People think of her as like, the Mary Jane of Daredevil, but that's not really true. Matt Murdock has had multiple love interests. Karen Page was one of them. And yes, she was there from issue 1, but she was introduced in issue 1 because the early Daredevil comics were bad knockoffs of Spider-Man. So Karen Page was the bad knockoff of Gwen Stacy, kind of. Uh, like, she was just kind of there as a potential love interest, but she was never
Mhm.
really used all that much. So in turning her into that sort of character, it's not like Frank, in Daredevil Born Again, she is a porn star at the start of the story and a heroin addict. That's like the
Mhm.
point of the story, right? But in turning her into that sort of character, it's not like Frank Miller was betraying these, like, long-standing fan relationships that people had built up with Karen Page. She just wasn't
Right.
that big of a part of the story, to be honest, and he
Mhm.
gave her a purpose. Uh, but Daredevil Born Again is 100% a decon recon, only of a more serious type than the Incredibles was. In Daredevil Born Again, it's about, is what Daredevil does even worth anything? What does it matter? You destroy everything. You break everything down. You completely self-destruct Matt Murdock's life and Karen Page's life, and then you see what's left in the wreckage, and then you see, is there anything in Matt Murdock that is still worth a damn? And the answer that they come up with is obviously yes. He's Daredevil. He's the defender of Hell's Kitchen. And what he does still matters. And what Karen Page, and the other ultimate conclusion that they come to is that Karen Page, who in the story sells out Daredevil's secret identity to the Kingpin for a hit of heroin, none of that matters at all because Matt Murdock realizes that that's never what was really important. That's never been the point of what he did. It's a way of getting back to the real grounded roots of the character, which is what Frank Miller understood so well about Daredevil. He really understood it about Daredevil more than any other writer ever did. That Daredevil was a Catholic hero is really the main thing that Frank Miller truly grasped. And he has a famous quote that's kind of funny, but it's also kind of deep, where he says that only a Catholic could be a lawyer and a vigilante. And while that is sort of a funny line, it also speaks to, like, there is something fundamental about the character that Frank Miller understands. Daredevil's Catholicism was not there from the very early days. It was added later on. But it was Frank Miller who realized that it was this aspect that really pulled the character together. Like, it made that character really work. If you figured, that this was the glue that held Matt Murdock together, and when everything else is stripped away, this is the thing about Matt that lasts. Matt claims it's the fighter. That's what he says as he collapses. Only the fighter remains, but the fighter collapses, and he's caught by a nun, and he's taken into a church.
Mhm.
So it's not the fighter that's at the core of Matt Murdock, it's the Catholic that's at the core of Matt Murdock.
Mhm.
And this is something that Frank Miller really, really grasped, and why I absolutely adore Daredevil Born Again. Uh, Bradford Fiona Wolf says, at least Incredibles remember to reconstruct. That's vital. Most don't do that nowadays. They repaired their superheroic works and their family life. Yes, if it had just been a parody, The Incredibles would have been amusing. The fact that it deconstructs it, or that it reconstructs what it deconstructs, is why The Incredibles is not just an amusing movie, but a great movie. And Bradford Walker says, even a nihilistic deconstruction of an archetype is itself telling. It means your enemies are a death cult, so you are dealing with fanatics beyond reason. Yes, that's the hidden implication of what we're getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
So,
actually and that actually ties into something else that I've been seeing, several times. People will say, "Oh, they're just comic books. Why do you care? They're so childish. Don't Shouldn't they have ended by now too? I mean,
no,
so
that
lame." We
it's
were
culture.
Well, there's an argument to be made about how long or how to continue using these, American fairy tales, because even Stan would say they were fairy tales. I've heard others compare them to fairy tales. But we were told by a carpenter 2,000 years ago that, Amen, I say to you, unless you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. What do children have that adults don't? I mean, aside from innocence, they recognize that dragons, evil, exists, that it is terrifying, and that we are weak creatures that cannot overcome it on our own merit and strength. Chesterton even says as much. He says, fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. Stories make us children again. We're sitting in the theater watching The Winter Soldier. The dragon is Hydra. Literally, you even go back to
Right.
the ultimate dragon in myth, aside from, well, the seven-headed dragon revelation isn't technically a myth. So you go back to the biggest,
Well,
baddest dragon
it is a
in,
myth, but not all myths are false.
right. That's right. So the thing is, you go back to the biggest, baddest dragon in history, Hydra, and there it has the advantage. It's in the sky, three helicarriers, essentially head and wing spread of the dragon. And what do we see? We see Galahad slay the dragon. He's an American Galahad and he's using a shield, not a sword, but it's the same story. They teach us that the dragon can be slain, that evil doesn't win in the end, that it can be beaten, that there is something greater than evil that we can choose and that will answer our prayers when we cry out. We just have to listen for the answer. And that's what you see Steve doing when he's standing on the um, dam, wondering if he can save Bucky, wondering if he can save the ideals. And this is again from Professor Geek, wondering if he can save the ideals that America was founded on, if there's any place left for them in the world. And it's, again, it's part of the Christ like mindset that the American people have had since their founding, which is okay, there's nobody here but us. It's up to us. And as Cap even says, and again, credit to Joss Whedon where credit is due. He doesn't believe it, but he calls Cap God's righteous man in the movie. He's the one who said when Cap gives the speech, it's a very Cap like speech. You get hurt him back. You get killed, walk it off. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what the fairy tales that say the dragon can be slain are meant to tell.
Right, exactly. And to go into, so I got distracted by myself because I'm such an interesting speaker. Uh, yeah, I got distracted by myself going through decon recons, and I was going to talk about briefly. And you're absolutely right about G.K. Chesterton's point on the dragon. What I was going to talk about was in One Punch Man. One Punch Man is a great example of a decon recon because it's almost a stealth example. It does not look like a decon recon when you first start watching it. It just looks like a deconstruction. It takes several episodes really to get to the reconstruction bit of One Punch Man. So I've talked about this on the show a few times before. I've written an article on it. But the premise of One Punch Man is that One Punch Man is a man who is so powerful he could defeat every enemy, no matter how strong, with one punch. And they set the power level pretty well by the end of season 1, when One Punch Man, our hero Saitama, who, by the way, his actual hero name in show is hilariously Caped Baldy, which is very funny. But anyway, so our hero Saitama, at the end of season 1, uh, has to take on an alien monster that has joined, that has gone around the universe destroying planets and like enslaving everyone just because it is bored. And it has been searching for Saitama because, like Saitama, whose whole storyline is that the fact that he destroys things in one punch made him bored, he's searching for Saitama so he could finally have a good fight. And the fight scene that follows in the final episode is legitimately one of the single greatest animated scenes in the history of animation. It is an absolutely jaw-dropping sequence of animation. I cannot say enough good things about it. Seriously, if you never watch a moment of One Punch Man, look up the fight between Saitama and Boros, who is the name of this monster. It's literally mind-blowing. Like, it's a jaw-dropping sequence. And at the end of the sequence, they have a great moment where One Punch Man, of course, wins the fight. But Boros realizes that One Punch Man, he has been promised that he would finally find the prophesied person who could give him a good fight and who he would have to use effort against. And Saitama tells Boros after defeating him, yeah, it was a good fight. And Boros says, no, you're lying. He's like, it wasn't a good fight for you at all. You took it easy on me. So, in other words, Saitama can one punch a malevolent, god eating, civilization destroying monster. This is the power level we're at.
Hmm.
Also leads to the great line because Boros says, he laughs, like, and says, so much for prophecies, like I was prophesied to have this great fight, but you didn't even break a sweat. The prophecy wasn't even true. So when they get to Earth, they're discussing that there was a prophecy to destroy Earth, and Saitama goes, it turns out prophecies are bunk anyway. I wouldn't worry about it, which was a pretty good line. But anyway, earlier in the show, though, it starts off with, like, you have Genos, and Genos
Hmm.
becomes, like, Saitama's disciple, and he's out for revenge on the people who killed his family. As Fiona Wolf says, he's explaining this to Saitama, and Saitama gets annoyed and says, explain in 20 words or less. I don't want to hear your complicated backstory. And we see Saitama's backstory at one point, and again, it's kind of a joke. Saitama is walking home, he's a salaryman, and he sees, like, a ridiculous-looking crab monster about to kill a child, and Saitama almost lets him do it because the child is so ugly. That's actually his thought process. And then he changes his mind because Japan's birth rate is so low, you really can't waste the kids. And then he kills the monster. And that starts him on his path to training to become a hero. But there is a sequence in One Punch Man that changes One Punch Man. So far, it's like what I said The Incredibles easily have been, which is an amusing parody. But, Deadpool is also an amusing parody. This is where the comparisons to Deadpool come from, right? There's a similarity in the two up to this point. I don't think Deadpool is a bad movie. I think that it's a morally ugly film, but that's not the same thing. It's well crafted and I think amusing. The jokes in Deadpool I find funny. So, One Punch Man so far has kind of similar jokes. Making fun of heroes, 20 words or less. Maybe I shouldn't save this kid. But the birth rate of Japan is kind of low. He's disappointed that things are too easy for him, which isn't how a hero is supposed to act. But something changes in the middle of the series. So there is a character who shows up known as the Deep Sea King, and he's there for a 2-episode arc. And in this 2-episode arc, the Deep Sea King takes on, one by one, all of the strongest heroes in the series besides Saitama. So the one thing that Saitama cannot do in story is fly. As Genos tells him when they're running towards someone, and he goes, "Wait a minute, you're just gonna run there?" And Saitama looks at him and goes, "Yeah, you know humans can't fly, right? Come on." So silly question. So Saitama cannot fly. So they're fighting the Deep Sea King, all of the strongest heroes, including Genos, who we know is very powerful himself. He's like the cyborg. And they're getting defeated one by one, absolutely crushed. And now there's like an entire building full of civilians that are about to be killed. And Genos sacrifices himself to save a child, and he's on the verge of death when a character shows up. Not One Punch Man, but the character of Moomin Rider. Moomin Rider represents, I think, what really the absolute core of what One Punch Man is trying to say. His superpower in the show is that he rides a bicycle, and that's it. That is his power. He rides a bicycle. But the key to Moomin Rider is that he is not a gag character. He's not treated as a joke. And he's the one, when all of the other heroes are defeated, you're waiting for Saitama to show up and to save everyone, and to fix things. And when Moomin Rider, shows up to meet Sea King, it's laughable. Like, there's no way he could beat the Deep Sea King. It's completely absurd. He's a dude on a bike.
Yeah.
Yells "Justice Crash," and like the roses bike into him. The Deep Sea King is momentarily distracted from killing Genos. He's flicked away, and Saitama gets up and he gives this speech with like the rain pouring around him, and they start playing the soundtrack behind it, and it's one of the first truly serious scenes in the entire series. And this is what I mean by Moomin Rider is not a joke character. He's not a gag. He says, "I know that I can't beat you. I'm not, I understand that, but it's not about winning or losing. It's about me taking you on right here and right now." And then the Deep Sea King now is just watching him as he like climbs to his feet with the rain around him. And then a little kid in the background starts yelling, "You could do it, Moomin Rider. You're the cyclist for justice. I believe in you." The music swells as all of the people start cheering for Moomin Rider. And you're waiting like, yeah, now he's gonna do it, right? But now the Deep Sea King is just annoyed, so he finally gives him like a full force punch. And
Mm.
that quiets everybody until you see that Saitama catches Moomin Rider. And Saitama says, "Hey, good fight, man." And he one punches the Deep Sea King. And so far, this has just been like an absolutely awesome sequence of events already. But it's not done yet. Yeah, Moomin Rider is cathartic, motivational, says Fiona Wolf, positive arc. Yeah, that's what I'm going to get at, though. But this is the real genius of the episode. So far, all of that is great on its own, but there's more. And this is why One Punch Man is a truly excellent show. So, we don't see the aftermath of this. We cut to after he one punches the Deep Sea King. Saitama is at home with Genos, and he gets a letter. And it's a piece of hate mail. And we were like, and Genos sees it and goes, "Should I find this guy?" But Saitama doesn't care. He goes, "Yeah, some people have too much time on their hands," and throws it out. So you're wondering why he got the hate mail. And they cut back to the end of that fight with the Moomin Rider. So there is some guy there who, after the fight, starts saying, "Yeah," he goes, I know this guy. This is Saitama. He always shows up, and every time he shows up, right after he arrives, the fight ends. I think he's taken the credit for other heroes' work." And then they
Wow.
start going, and then somebody goes, "Hey, that's ridiculous. And he goes, "Oh, really? Is it ridiculous?" "Tell you, how about this?" He goes, "How strong could this monster have been if he took it out in one punch? I mean, did what the heroes do really matter?" He's like, "Come on, like it's totally. So Saitama decides to say, goes, "Yeah, that's right." He goes, "Remember my name, I'm Saitama." He goes, "And I took out this hero, not Genos." He goes, "Sure, they might have softened him up for me, right?" He goes, "But I did it." And then all of the people turn on him. But they turn on him because he is acting as if they were the ones that all of their sacrifices really mattered, right? He's making it appear to the people that, yeah, he took the credit for it so that nobody minimizes what the other heroes did. And he's willing to let his own reputation suffer because ultimately, just like Moomin Rider is a true hero, Saitama is also a true hero. He doesn't suffer physically, but he's willing to sacrifice what the things that he can lose, his own reputation, if it means that the other heroes and the faith in the other heroes is preserved. And the story ends with Moomin Rider. One Punch Man gets a thank you letter, but there's no name on the letter, and they don't know who sent it. So he goes out to get food. And when he goes out to get food, the person sitting next to him at the ramen stall is Moomin Rider. And Moomin Rider looks at him and says, "So you got my letter, right?" And the reveal is that Moomin Rider is the person who sent Saitama the thank you letter. So there's sort of a mutual thing going on where they're saying what the heroes do does matter. Saitama inspires people like Moomin Rider. Moomin Rider inspires the regular people. And One Punch Man, Saitama's sacrifices mean something to the other heroes and the faith that the other heroes have. Just because he's not sacrificing himself physically doesn't mean that Saitama isn't making sacrifices for the greater good. It doesn't mean that he's not a selfless person. And the fact that Moomin Rider can't make those physical sacrifices on the flip side of this doesn't mean that the things that Moomin Rider does are useless. What Moomin Rider is doing is clearly incredibly important. In fact, it's what inspires all of those other people there. Like, that inspiration that Moomin Rider gave was real. It mattered. And
Yeah.
that's what One Punch Man really, really grasped and why it's such a great show, ultimately. Unfortunately, season 2 was a massive step down in terms of animation, but it's a great decon recon. You were going to say something?
No, I was agreeing with you. I still
Yeah,
have to watch One Punch Man myself, but from everything I've heard, they did a really good job with the decon recon.
yeah. It's an interesting storytelling device, and I think important nowadays. Kingdom Come is arguably also an example of a decon recon. Fiona Wolf points out, even if he's more street level in terms of scope and power, the street level guys can inspire the cosmic level guys, One Punch Man, and in turn, that makes Saitama take a more aspirational setup. Yes, that's true. Because One Punch Man is really about how, like, it asks this question. Saitama can defeat all of these monsters in one punch. So, it asks a few things. Number one, do what the other heroes do really matter? If Saitama can handle it all himself anyway. Number two, is what Saitama's doing really heroic if he's not putting himself at risk? Saitama's not putting himself at risk, so is he even really a hero? And three, is there even such a thing as heroism in a world where people like Saitama exist? Because all of the actions of these heroes are potentially meaningless if you could just have a guy come in and with no risk to himself one punch it.
Mm.
But that's not what the message of the show is. The answer to those questions is yes, the heroes do matter. Yes, Saitama is a hero. And yes, heroism does exist, even in a world like One Punch Man. It takes something that I think like Watchmen has with Ozymandias, that Superman figure, and then it uses that to conclude that heroism doesn't exist. And One Punch Man
Yeah.
says, no, not that easy. Because there are sacrifices, just because you can have the ability to do anything physically, there are still sacrifices that you need to make. There are still things that people can do that matter to other people. Things don't just stop mattering because they become easy. And it's also kind of amusing that even though Saitama is at the peak of all things physically, he's not actually the greatest at everything. There's a running gag that he keeps losing to another hero in video games. And this frustrates him. It also is completely nonsensical because like his reflexes should be off the charts, but it's still funny. Uh, it's a gag and it's a good one. There's a similar point that they actually make at the end of the Chimera Ant arc of the shonen anime Hunter x Hunter, where the villain of that arc, the Chimera Ant King, is the peak of all things mentally and physically, to the point where he's actually starting to find it kind of boring, and he's looking for people, all of the top players in the world, at various mental games. And he finds a girl who is, I forgot her name, Kamugi, I believe. He finds a blind girl named Kamugi who is the greatest at the game of not chess that they made up, and called like I don't even remember. It was like some type of version of fantasy chess, right? And she was
Yeah.
the greatest player in the world at this game. And the Chimera Ant King's whole arc is predicated on the fact that no matter how powerful he is, no matter who he can kill, no matter the fact that nobody can possibly face him in battle, and the fact that he could kill Kamugi at any time, which he points out himself, he cannot beat her at this game. Like, he just can't win. There is a great scene where he tells her, clearly I'm not taking it seriously enough. So tell you what, I'm going to make a bet. I'll give you something if you win this next game, and if I win, what are you willing to bet? And she says, I'll bet my life. And then he's like, wait, what? I didn't tell you to do that. And she goes, well, the thing is that this is all I know how to do. So if I ever lost, I would be a burden on my family, so I might as well be dead. And he goes, I no wonder I'm losing. Like, clearly my resolve is nowhere near the level of yours. I completely misunderstood what we were doing. Uh, but it's an interesting thing. It's this idea that, like, this is the thing that gets him to realize, although he doesn't like to admit it at first, that
Mhm.
there are other things in life besides physical power, right?
Yeah.
There are things that even the great, Chimera Ant King simply will not be able to do, and
Yeah.
that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, and this actually ties into something. Someone was very kind and shared a Tom Simon article with me called "The Taste for Magic." If anybody's
Oh, it's
interested,
a brilliant article.
it'll pop up on my website tomorrow. There's going to be a link to it. So if you
That is
you
one of my
can't find it
favorite
now,
Tom
it'll be
Simon
there.
articles.
But the part that jumped out at me when I was reading it first is the part on uh, third class Lovecrafts and fifth rate cabals about modern practitioners of magic, which, as Screwtape called them, are not so much different than the materialist magician who believes in forces while denying the existence of spirits. To justify dealing with spirits who can grant unwholesome wishes, I'm quoting now, she, the practitioner, denies both God and the devil. This allows her to think of these spirits and her spells as morally neutral, or better yet, to shirk moral questions altogether. Cover up the fact that her rites are largely based upon a travesty of Christian rituals and make little sense without that context. She pretends that they are derived from the old religions, which Christianity merely aped and perverted. These assumptions granted, she can do as she likes without troubling her conscience. And that sums up a lot of people. They think because that sums up the Chimera Ant King in the series. He thinks because he has all this power and can do all this stuff physically, that's the most important thing. And that's actually one of the things that really irritates me about Disassembled, House of M, and now Multiversive Madness,
Yes.
because they're putting the Scarlet Witch, who was not conceived as this type of character in the original comics. She was actually brought in to the Avengers primarily to get girls to read superhero comics because at the time, and probably still today, girls are more interested in romances than in superheroes. So she was brought in. She was, and this actually ties back into Stan's love of fairy tales. He says in the introduction to Marvel Masterworks 3, and if you'll give me a minute, it's only one paragraph and it's easy enough to read. There it is. Our follow-up tale, Once an Avenger, features Kang the Conqueror and has, for me, the feeling of an old-fashioned fairy tale, with the evil villain in love with a beautiful princess and our heroes battling to save a kingdom and the hand of a fair maiden, as only Marvel's Avengers can do it. I actually have a article on my newsletter site, my Substack, where I go into the fact that Wanda Maximoff is the princess in the Dragon Knight prince story um, story pattern, and that this is her purpose in the comics. She can uh, fight with the guys, but she does so in a passive manner that supports them rather than stand in the front. She's not Captain Marvel. She's not She Hulk. She's um, she's a ranged fighter from the back, from the rear, and she's very good in that role. But they take they took her powers and her position as a potential materialist magician, and they have removed the moral aspect from her character, and it's made an absolute hash of not only Wanda and her character, but the entire Marvel universe. And it's the same way with this, because just because you can, or just because theoretically you could, because I'm not entirely sure the power creep they gave her and some other characters would hold up if you actually put it to the test. That doesn't mean you should, but the writers, because they have abandoned morality, because they have stopped treating the story honestly and are focused primarily on beating the audience with sticks for trusting them in the first place don't care. And that's where the fall of heroism in Marvel really stems from and where it really leads.
Very good. We're at 9:01, so I'm going to cut it off, even though it's kind of a shame because I'd love to. I know that you were a big fan of Scarlet Witch, so it would have been good if we had gotten into that a little bit, but we went a long way around in this conversation, so I am okay with that for now. The only thing I'm going to mention is that I'm looking through the comments on that Tom Simon article, The Taste for Magic. It's an absolutely brilliant article, and I note with amusement that I wrote a comment on that article all the way back in 2016. So 6 years ago, uh, I wrote a comment on that Tom Simon article where I called it brilliant. On the same day that John C. Wright also wrote a comment, also complimenting the article, so I find that amusing. It was originally written in 2008. Anybody who has not read any Tom Simon's fantastic essays, I'm going to just go on the record and say that they are truly fantastic. If there is a modern day forebear to G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, and at least in terms of his nonfiction writing, it is Tom Simon. So I have seen multiple attempts to try and mimic the screw tape style, and the only person I have ever seen do it with any amount of success at all, to the point where they seem like their own original thing, but also keeping to the spirit of screw tape, and having the same level of clarity and insight, are Tom Simon's Smiggy McStudge essays, specifically his essays, Death by Bebop and Zombie Opera. His Smiggy McStudge essays are highly recommended, as well as his normal essay, The Taste for Magic, and generally any essay books he has. I think the three he has out currently are Style is the Rocket, Death Carries a Camcorder, and his book of Tolkien essays, which are highly recommended, Writing Down the Dragon. Anyway, that is all for today. So I will confirm with Ben to double check, but Ben,
Hmm?
assuming that you are there, yep, hello. We have an author coming in next week, correct?
Yep. J. Manfred, I think his last name is Weichel.
Yeah, Weichel. Yes, J. Manfred Weichel. He is the author of a variety of books, including Jungle Jitters, Ibu Gogo. Uh, I'm blanking on the names. But I have read his work before. He is an excellent author. I would not show him to children, but if you are an adult and you are in the mood for a very dark very dark satire, he is the guy for you. It's insightful, it is entertaining, and I am quite a fan. We will be interviewing him next week. He is an interesting guy. His work is very different from anything else coming out right now. And we will also cross fingers. Should I announce this or no?
I have no idea what you're referring to.
The story he's planning on writing.
Oh, yeah, no. Not until we have it in hand.
Glad I asked. Okay. Anyway,
Ignore this
we'll be
conversation. You heard nothing. Nothing.
yes. The point is, we'll be talking with Mr. Weichel next week, and I'm actually looking forward to the discussion because his work is so different from anybody else's out there. It's bound to be interesting to hear his thought process. Caroline, thank you for joining us again. I appreciate you filling in when Ben's not here.
I thought
And
I would
it's
be
always a pleasure.
gone.
You're welcome. It was fun to hang out.
I'm glad to hear
Have
it.
a good night, everybody.
Good night.